The doors opened, and the entire room forgot how to breathe. She stepped into the ballroom wearing a crimson gown that moved like it had its own gravity, and for a few seconds, just a few, every conversation in that room lost its thread. Glasses paused halfway to mouths. Heads turned without permission. She wasn't performing. She wasn't trying. She simply walked in. And across the room, a man named Caleb Merritt felt something drop out of his chest entirely. Because he recognized her. He recognized the tilt of her chin, the calm in her shoulders, the quiet, devastating confidence of a woman who had nothing left to prove to anyone in that room, and especially not to him. He recognized her because he had spent 3 years telling her she wasn't enough. His girlfriend, Vanessa, had believed she was the most beautiful woman at the gala all evening. She had been right until approximately 30 seconds ago. The woman in the red dress hadn't said a word, hadn't looked in Caleb's direction once, hadn't even tried. She didn't have to. Tell me, have you ever watched someone walk into a room and completely own it without even trying? Because what happened next in that ballroom changed everything for everyone in it. Stay with me. But to understand why that moment hit the way it did, why it unraveled everything, you have to go back. Back to the woman she was before the gown, before the confidence, back to when she was still learning how to disappear. Her name was Miriam Calloway. Before Caleb, before the marriage, before all of it, Miriam had been the kind of woman people remembered. Not loudly, not in a way that demanded attention, but in the way that certain people leave an impression simply by being entirely themselves, warm, grounded, quietly luminous. She had grown up in Ashfield, Virginia, the youngest of 3 siblings in a house full of books and worn furniture and parents who believed deeply in the importance of showing up for your community. Her mother volunteered at the public library every Saturday morning without fail. Her father coached Little League for 15 years and never once asked to be thanked for it. Miriam grew up believing that the most meaningful things a person could do were usually the quiet ones, the ones nobody photographed. She studied literature and education at the University of Richmond, where she graduated with honors and immediately began working as a reading specialist for an underserved elementary school in Richmond's East End. She spent her summers helping organize a community reading program, the kind that operated out of a church basement with donated books and folding chairs, the kind that changed children's lives in ways that never made the news. She loved elegant things, a well-tailored dress, the architecture of old Virginia buildings, the way a good restaurant smelled on a rainy evening. She had a natural eye for beauty, but she wore it lightly, the way people do when they aren't trying to prove anything. She was 31 when she met Caleb Merritt at a mutual friend's engagement dinner in downtown Richmond. He was charming in the way that very ambitious men often are before they get what they want. He listened. He asked follow-up questions. He remembered things she had mentioned only once. He laughed at her jokes, the real ones, not the polite laughs she'd learned to expect. He told her about his career in private equity with a kind of energy that felt like passion rather than ego, at least in those early months. They dated for just over a year before he proposed. By then, Miriam had already started quietly rearranging herself around him. It happened so gradually she didn't notice. Or, well, maybe she noticed and chose not to look directly at it. Either way, by the time they were engaged, small pieces of who Miriam had been were already being filed away. Caleb never issued ultimatums. He was too smart for that. He made observations. Soft, almost gentle observations that arrived wrapped in the language of love. You don't need all that makeup, he'd say. I fell in love with the natural you. Or, you're so much more interesting than those women who have to try this hard. You're above that. Or, a woman like you doesn't need to perform. That's what I've always loved about you. And Miriam, who had grown up being told that real love was quiet and sacrificial and about the other person, heard these things as compliments, as proof that he saw her, that he valued the real her over the performative version. It wasn't until much later that she would understand what was actually happening, that these observations, so delicately phrased, so lovingly delivered, were instructions, a slow, patient project of reduction. Caleb didn't want Miriam to be beautiful for herself. He wanted her to be modest so that no one else would look. But that understanding would come much later. By the time they married and settled into a handsome townhouse in the Carytown neighborhood of Richmond, Miriam had stopped wearing the bold dresses she used to love. She wore simple cardigans and muted colors. She kept her hair clean, but unstyled. She went to community events dressed to disappear rather than to arrive. And she believed, sincerely and completely, that this was what love required. That making space for someone else meant making yourself smaller. She continued volunteering at the Literacy Foundation, continued working with children who were falling behind in reading, continued writing in the journal she'd kept since college. But her dreams, the one she used to speak aloud about opening a proper literacy center for kids in Richmond's underserved neighborhoods, had been reduced to whispers she mostly kept to herself. Caleb had never said those dreams were unimportant. He had simply never asked about them. Caleb Merritt's ambition had a sound. It was the sound of a name being repeated in rooms he was not in yet. The sound of a reputation being built, one carefully attended event at a time. He had worked in finance since graduating from the University of Virginia's Business School, and he had worked hard, genuinely, legitimately hard. Long hours, difficult deals, the kind of focus that doesn't leave much room for anything else. By the time he and Miriam married, he had secured a senior position at a prestigious private equity firm called Halcyon Capital, based in a glass tower on Richmond's west side, the kind of building designed to remind everyone inside it that they had arrived somewhere significant. His colleagues were ambitious in the same way he was. They attended charity galas and foundation dinners, not entirely out of philanthropy, but because that was where the relationships were, where deals started as handshakes and grew into 8-figure contracts, where reputation was currency and how you presented yourself and who you stood beside was part of the investment. Caleb started attending these events more frequently as his career climbed. At first, he brought Miriam. She accompanied him gracefully, spoke warmly to the people she met, and spent the evening being genuinely curious about the guests around her rather than performing for them. Several people told Caleb afterward that his wife was lovely. He smiled and agreed. But inside, something had already begun to shift. Because the women Caleb encountered at these events, the partners, the consultants, the financiers and philanthropists, dressed with a particular intentionality. Their elegance was deliberate. Their conversation was practiced and commanding. They carried themselves as though they understood the value of being perceived. Caleb began to find something magnetic about that. The glamour of effort. The visible performance of success. Miriam's quietness, which he had once described as depth, began to feel like absence. He started saying things at home. Small things. The kind that arrive without warning, do their damage, and then disappear before you can examine them. You might enjoy getting dressed up a little more. It doesn't hurt to put in some effort. I'm not saying anything negative. I just think you have more to offer than you show. The women at these events, they present themselves. There's a confidence in that. I'm just observing. Miriam heard these things and felt the familiar confusion of someone being criticized for exactly what they were asked to become. She had stopped dressing glamorously because Caleb had told her she didn't need to. And now he was telling her she should try harder. She brought this up once, carefully, gently. Caleb had looked at her with an expression she couldn't quite name. Not guilt, not acknowledgement, something closer to impatience, and said he didn't remember saying that. She let it go. She was good at letting things go. It was around this time that Vanessa Holt entered the picture. Vanessa Holt was what happened when ambition dressed itself in beauty and spent years studying how rooms work. She had arrived in Richmond 2 years prior after a decade of circulating through Atlanta's finance and consulting worlds, followed by a brief but highly visible stretch in Charlotte. She had never built anything herself. No company, no career with a clear institutional anchor. But she moved between industries with a fluidity that made people assume she was successful in whatever field she currently claimed. Her LinkedIn profile was artfully vague. Her references were real, but carefully curated. Her appearance was impeccable. Always. She showed up at a Halcyon Capital networking event on a Wednesday evening in late September, introduced to Caleb by a mutual colleague named Preston, who would later admit he didn't actually know her well at all, just that she'd asked to be introduced to someone in the upper tier of the equity side. Caleb was captivated within 20 minutes. Not because Vanessa was extraordinary, but because she was extraordinarily good at reflecting back to people exactly what they most wanted to see in themselves. She told Caleb he had the kind of intelligence that was rare in rooms like these. She asked questions about his work that made him feel like his field was fascinating, when in fact she was cataloging the answers. She laughed in the right places. She mentioned, casually, that she'd recently advised a fund based in D.C. that had achieved a significant return. She didn't offer details, and Caleb, flattered, a little dazzled, didn't ask for them. She had read him in approximately 10 minutes. The need for admiration. The belief in his own inevitability. The simmering restlessness of a man who has achieved a great deal, but still feels vaguely cheated by the distance between where he is and where he imagined he would be. She knew exactly what to do with that. Their professional connection turned social over the following weeks. They began attending the same events. Caleb convinced himself this was coincidence. He started lingering at these gatherings longer than necessary, telling Miriam he had client obligations that ran late. Vanessa was always there, always poised, always interested in what he had to say. At home, Miriam waited. She prepared dinner at the times he used to come home. She kept the townhouse peaceful. She asked about his work when he came in late carrying the smell of expensive restaurants on his jacket, and he gave her answers that were just enough to close the conversation without actually sharing anything. She told herself this was the cost of ambition, that he was building something and she had agreed, in marriage, to support that building. She didn't understand, yet that she was being slowly, methodically closed out of the life she thought she was in. One evening, near the end of October, Caleb came home and found Miriam at the kitchen table working through a grant proposal for the literacy center she'd been quietly developing. She had spread papers across the table, budget outlines, program descriptions, a timeline. She looked up when he walked in, and for a moment she forgot to hide how pleased she was with the work in front of her. He glanced at the papers, didn't ask what they were, set his keys on the counter, and said, "Did you eat already?" She watched him move through the kitchen without looking at her and understood, in a way she hadn't quite let herself understand before, that he was no longer interested in who she was. He was simply tolerating who she wasn't. If you've ever stayed in a situation longer than you should have, not because you didn't see it, but because you loved the person you believed they were capable of being, you already know how Miriam felt in that kitchen. Leave a comment below. Tell me, at what point do you think she should have walked away? The company dinner was held at Arden's, a restaurant on the north side of Richmond that was the kind of place where the lighting was so carefully calculated it made everyone look like they were posing for a magazine cover. Dark wood, low music, tablecloths that were ironed fresh every morning. It was the sort of restaurant that felt like a statement in every direction. Halcyon Capital had organized the dinner to celebrate the closing of a major acquisition, a deal Caleb had been central to, and for the first time in months, he told Miriam she should come. She spent 2 hours getting ready. Not obsessively, not desperately, but genuinely. She chose a navy dress she hadn't worn in over a year, spent time with her hair, wore small pearl earrings she'd inherited from her grandmother. She looked graceful. She felt something close to herself again. In the car on the way there, Caleb adjusted his cuffs and didn't say anything about how she looked. She told herself it didn't matter. At the restaurant, she moved alongside Caleb through the greeting process, colleagues stopping to congratulate him, partners introducing their spouses, the familiar choreography of professional social events. Miriam was warm and attentive, asking questions, laughing at the right moments, holding her own in every conversation she entered. Then a man named Greg Paulson, one of the senior partners at Halcyon, turned to Caleb mid-conversation and said warmly, "Is this your wife? You must be so proud having her here." Caleb laughed. It was a particular kind of laugh. Short, performative. The laugh of a man using sound to deflect rather than respond. "Miriam's more comfortable in a library than a place like this," he said. "She's our resident, quiet type." The small group around them absorbed the comment in various ways. Greg looked briefly uncomfortable. Two of the other partners' spouses forced polite smiles. A junior associate glanced away. Miriam felt the color leave her face for exactly 3 seconds. Then she brought it back. She smiled gently, said something soft and diplomatic that moved the conversation forward, and spent the rest of the evening being impeccably composed in the way that takes enormous, invisible effort. But something had broken. Not bent, broken. The kind of break that doesn't make a sound, but that you feel in your chest for a very long time afterward. On the way home that night, the car was silent until Miriam finally said, quietly, "Why did you say that?" Caleb glanced at her. "Say what?" She repeated it, not accusingly, just clearly. He exhaled through his nose, said that she was being sensitive. That was just a joke, that nobody thought anything of it. That Greg Paulson had laughed. Didn't she see that? He laughed. Miriam turned and looked out the window at the Richmond skyline passing by. She didn't argue. She knew there was nothing to argue with. The problem wasn't that he had misspoken. The problem was that he had meant it. That in that brief, casual moment at the restaurant, she had seen with total clarity who she was to him. Not a partner. Not a woman he admired. Not someone he was proud to stand beside. A liability. She was a liability he hadn't found a way to remove yet. Caleb filed for divorce 4 months later. By then, he and Vanessa had been seen together at 3 separate events. Mutual acquaintances had stopped pretending not to know. His behavior at home had moved from cold to absent. He came home to sleep and left again by 6 every morning. He stopped asking about her day. He stopped sitting at the table for dinner. He stopped being in a room even when he was physically present. When he finally said the words, he said them sitting in the living room of their townhouse on a Tuesday evening, still in his work clothes. He had the posture of a man who had rehearsed this. He told her that they wanted different things, that he needed a partner who could match the world he'd built. That Miriam, for all her qualities, had never truly tried to grow alongside him. She listened to all of it. Then she said, very quietly, "I changed everything about myself for you. And the only thing you ever asked me to change was to become someone you didn't have to be embarrassed by." He said that wasn't fair. She said nothing else. The divorce took 11 weeks. Miriam didn't contest anything beyond what was legally reasonable. She secured a fair settlement, moved into a 2-bedroom apartment in the museum district, and began the strange, quiet, disorienting work of rebuilding a life. The first month was the hardest. She would wake up at 3 in the morning with no particular thought in her head, just a heaviness, a formless weight that pressed down without a source. She'd lie in the dark and replay the restaurant, the laugh, Greg Paulson's expression, the car ride home. She'd replay the kitchen with the grant papers, the unanswered questions, the years of herself she had quietly filed away in boxes she wasn't sure she knew how to reopen. Before we go any further into what happened next, take a moment to like this video, subscribe to Orvin's Stories, and drop a comment telling me where you're watching from. I genuinely want to know how far these stories travel. And this one is worth staying for. Her friends came back, the ones she drifted from during the marriage. They came back with the particular tenderness of people who knew better than to say they'd seen it coming. They brought coffee and long walks along the canal walk and dinner parties that ran too late and ended in the kind of laughter that isn't performance, the kind that comes up from somewhere real. She kept going to the Literacy Foundation. The children didn't know she was going through anything. They needed her to help them find the right books, to sit beside them while they sounded out words, to celebrate the small victories that nobody except their teacher ever witnessed. And in giving them that presence, she found herself returning to herself, piece by piece, without ever trying. One afternoon in March, she walked through Carytown, her old neighborhood, the one where she'd lived with Caleb, and stopped in front of a boutique she'd always walked past without going in. In the window was a dress, deep crimson, fitted through the waist, flowing to the floor. Simple, devastating. She stood there for a long moment. Then she went inside. The Hargrove Foundation Gala was held every spring at the Jefferson Hotel, one of Richmond's most iconic buildings, its rotunda ceiling soaring above guests dressed in the finest things they owned. Miriam had been invited by the foundation's director, Claudette Harmon, who had watched Miriam's volunteer hours climb quietly toward 200 over the past year, and wanted her present at the celebration. "You've earned your seat at this table," Claudette told her. "I want you there. Miriam had nearly declined. The thought of a gala, with its particular social architecture, the evaluating glances, the performative networking, the politics of who stood next to whom, made her tired in a way she could feel in her spine. But she thought about the crimson dress hanging in her closet. She thought about the woman she'd been before she started filing herself away. And she said yes. She spent the day of the gala with a calm she hadn't expected. She did her hair in a way she hadn't in years, swept and elegant, the way she used to wear it before Caleb's gentle instructions to keep it simple. She applied her makeup with care and intention. She stepped into the red dress and stood in front of the mirror for a long moment. She didn't see someone trying to prove a point. She saw herself. That was the extraordinary thing. Not that she looked beautiful, though she did, but that she looked entirely, recognizably, undeniably like herself. Like the woman who had existed before she agreed to become smaller. Like someone who had walked through something genuinely difficult and had not come out diminished on the other side. She arrived at the Jefferson alone, her small clutch under one arm, and walked toward the entrance with the specific composure of a woman who is not performing calm, but simply has it. The doorman held the door. She stepped inside. Vanessa Holt had been in the ballroom for 40 minutes by the time the doors opened again. She had been magnificent. She understood how to work a room in the way a conductor understands an orchestra, timing, position, dynamics. She moved through the crowd at exactly the right speed. She laughed in exactly the right places. She wore a gown of champagne silk that made the women near her feel slightly underdressed and the men slightly breathless. Caleb had watched her work the room and felt the familiar satisfaction of a man who has traded one thing for something that glitters. Vanessa paused beside him near the entrance to the garden terrace and accepted a glass of champagne from a passing server. She murmured something about how the gala was exactly the kind of room she liked, meaning it was full of people worth knowing. Caleb smiled. Then the doors at the far end of the ballroom opened. He heard it before he saw it. A subtle shift in the room's acoustic. The way sound bends slightly when something unexpected happens. He looked toward the entrance instinctively, the way everyone does. And there she was, the red dress, the composed, unhurried stride, the absence of performance in every line of her. It took him 2 full seconds to understand that he was looking at Miriam. Miriam, who he had called unattractive. Miriam, who he had described as a quiet librarian at a company dinner and laughed at his own joke. Miriam, who he had left, in part, because he believed she had nothing more to offer the world he was building. She walked through the entrance and into the chandelier light, and the ballroom reorganized itself around her arrival without any instruction from her. Guests turned. Conversations paused. People leaned toward each other to quietly ask who she was. The foundation staff, who knew her, came forward warmly. Claudette Harmon crossed the room with her arms open. Miriam embraced her with a naturalness that made the warmth between them visible from 15 feet away. She accepted a glass of champagne and began moving through the crowd with the easy confidence of someone who is not in a hurry to be anywhere but here. Several people approached her within minutes. A prominent Richmond attorney named Dennis Waite, who served on the foundation's board, introduced himself and asked about her work with the literacy program. She spoke about it with clarity and passion, the children she worked with, the grant proposal she was developing for a dedicated center, the research behind early literacy intervention. Dennis listened carefully. Then he said, "You should speak with Sandra Cho. She runs the Cho Family Foundation, and they've been looking for exactly this kind of program." Miriam said she would love to be introduced. Across the room, Caleb watched all of this. Vanessa noticed him watching. "Do you know her?" she asked, her voice arranged into casual curiosity. Caleb paused for a moment too long. "No," he said. Vanessa looked at him. The pause had told her everything she needed to know, and Vanessa Holt had not built the life she'd built by ignoring information. "Excuse me for a moment," she said. She moved toward the terrace, champagne flute in hand, her posture perfect, her expression serene. She did not come back. Seeing Caleb watch Miriam from across that ballroom, watch the woman he dismissed become the woman everyone wanted to know, I have to ask you, do you believe people like Caleb are capable of truly understanding what they've lost? Or does that kind of person always find a way to rewrite the story, so they're still the one who chose right? Tell me honestly in the comments. Vanessa had not come to the Hargrove Foundation Gala entirely for the champagne and the connections. She had been preparing for this evening for 3 months. The process had been methodical, careful, and invisible, exactly the way all of her processes were. She had spent her time with Caleb, not simply attending events and enjoying his credit cards, though she had done both. She had spent it learning. The access codes for the financial apps he kept on the phone he left on the kitchen counter. The account numbers embedded in the documents he stored in a shared cloud folder he'd added her to for convenience. The name of his financial advisor. The timing of his quarterly bonus deposits. Vanessa knew that a man who was busy admiring her would not notice her other activities. She had been right. The transfer she had arranged moved through a layered series of accounts she had established over the past 18 months. A constellation of LLCs registered in Delaware and Wyoming, real accounts attached to real addresses, designed to create distance between the source and the destination. She had done this before, though never at quite this scale. While the gala moved forward inside the ballroom, Vanessa stood on the terrace with her phone, her champagne half finished, the Richmond skyline quiet behind her. She confirmed the final transfer with 4 touches of her thumb. Watched the confirmation screen appear. Then she set her champagne flute on the stone balustrade, picked up her clutch, and walked down the terrace steps to a waiting car she had booked 3 hours earlier. She did not go back inside. She did not say goodbye. The car took her to a hotel near the airport, where she had already checked in under a different name. By the time Caleb began looking for her in the ballroom, Vanessa Holt was sitting in a hotel room, eating room service, and reviewing her next set of arrangements with the calm efficiency of someone whose entire life had been preparation for exactly this kind of evening. Caleb noticed she was gone sometime after the speeches. He checked the terrace, the lounge near the entrance, the bar. He asked a server. Nobody had seen her leave. He called her phone. Voicemail. He called 3 more times over the next hour. 3 times more. By the time he drove home alone through the Richmond streets at midnight, a thread of something cold and very different from loneliness had begun unspooling in his chest. By morning, he would understand what it was. Caleb discovered the transfers at 7:14 a.m. He'd woken early with a residual unease from the night before and opened his banking app the way he always did, a habit from years of watching numbers move, and the first number he saw didn't make sense. He stared at it for a moment the way you stare at a word that has suddenly stopped looking like a word, waiting for it to reorganize itself into something familiar. It didn't. He sat up, opened a second account, then a third. A total of 4 accounts across 2 institutions have been accessed using credentials and security responses that could only have been provided by someone who had spent time studying exactly how he managed his finances. The amounts were staggered, not all from a single account, nothing so obvious, distributed carefully in a way designed to pass through automated fraud detection. He called Vanessa's phone. Disconnected. He pulled up her contact information in his email and found a chain of messages, warm, professional, occasionally intimate, that now read entirely differently than they had a week ago. He went through them with the specific nausea of a man reconstructing, in real time, how thoroughly he had been deceived. The mentions of projects in D.C. He never asked which firm. The easy familiarity with his schedule that he'd read as attentiveness and now understood was surveillance. The gentle encouragements to use one specific banking app over another. The night, 6 weeks in, when she'd borrowed his phone to check the weather, and he'd handed it over without a second thought. He called his financial advisor. He called a lawyer. He filed a report with the Richmond Police Department, then with the FBI's Financial Crimes Division when it became clear the transfers crossed state lines. And then he sat in his home office, the same home office where he had once rehearsed and delivered his divorce speech to Miriam, and stared at the wall. He was not a man given to genuine self-examination. But in that room, in the particular silence of a morning after a spectacular loss, the first unguarded thought arrived before he could filter it. He had left a woman who loved him for a woman who was studying him. He had called Miriam dull when she was simply honest. He had called her simple when she was simply real. He had stood beside her at a company dinner and made a joke at her expense because he wanted to seem like the kind of man who had outgrown her. And now he had an apartment full of furniture he'd bought to impress a woman who had been gone since approximately 10:47 p.m. the night before. The thought did not make him a better man in that moment. It simply made him a smaller one, closer to the correct size. What happened to Caleb is the kind of thing that can only occur when a person's vanity exceeds their judgment. And I know some people will say he got what he deserved, but I want to hear from you. Do you feel any sympathy for him? Or did he build this entirely himself? Drop your thoughts in the comments. I read every single one. The introduction to Sandra Cho happened at the gala before the evening ended. Dennis Waite found Miriam near the dessert table and brought Sandra over, a compact, direct woman in her mid-50s with the kind of energy that suggested she had very little patience for anything without substance. She shook Miriam's hand and said, "Dennis tells me you're building something in early literacy. Tell me what you actually have." Miriam told her, not the polished, non-profit pitch version, not the carefully softened language she used when she wasn't sure how the listener would receive her ambition. She told Sandra Cho exactly what she had been building. The research base, the demographic data, the program structure, the gap she had identified in Richmond's southeast corridor, where 3 elementary schools had no dedicated literacy support beyond classroom instruction. Sandra asked 7 sharp questions. Miriam answered all 7. At the end of the conversation, Sandra gave her a business card and said, "Send me the grant proposal. All of it. Next Tuesday." The Hargrove Foundation Gala ended at 11. Miriam drove home to her apartment in the museum district with the windows down despite the April chill. She was not thinking about Caleb, or about Vanessa's early exit, or about the moment the room had shifted when she walked in. She was thinking about the grant proposal, about the question Sandra had asked that had identified exactly the 2 areas she needed to strengthen before Tuesday. She was thinking about the children. She was thinking about what it would mean to give them the kind of place her mother used to take her. The Saturday mornings at the library, the smell of paper and carpet cleaner, the quiet that wasn't empty, but somehow full of possibility. She was thinking about the center she was going to build. The months that followed moved with the particular momentum that happens when the right resources meet the right purpose at the right time. The Cho Family Foundation approved a 3-year grant. The Richmond Community Development Office identified a location in a converted building near the school with the highest need. Claudette Harmon helped assemble a board of directors. 3 of the teachers Miriam had worked with at the elementary school signed on as program consultants. Miriam hired a director of programs, a community outreach coordinator, and 2 reading specialists. She spent her mornings at the foundation and her afternoons in the space they were preparing, overseeing renovations, selecting books, setting up the kind of reading corners she had always imagined, the ones with good lighting and soft chairs and a deliberate absence of anything that would make a child feel unwelcome. She named the center the Calloway Reading House. Her mother's name had been Miriam Calloway. The day the center opened, 63 children from 3 neighboring elementary schools came through the doors in the first 4 hours. Miriam stood near the entrance and watched them move through the space she had built and felt something that was not triumph, not vindication, not any of the emotion she might have felt if any part of this had been about proving something to someone who had once dismissed her. It was simply joy, pure, clean, uncomplicated, the kind of feeling that doesn't require an audience. Caleb Merritt spent the better part of a year in the aftermath of Vanessa's departure managing the financial and legal wreckage she had left behind. Investigators recovered a portion of what had been transferred. A larger portion was gone. The case moved slowly through the federal system, as it always does. The professional reputation damage was less traceable, but just as real. Colleagues talked. The story leaked, the way stories always do in professional circles that run on information. He was not fired. His track record protected him from that. But the particular kind of social standing he had built, the glamour of being a man who moved through influential rooms with a captivating partner on his arm, evaporated in the way of things built on nothing structural. He heard about the Calloway Reading House through a professional contact who had met Miriam at a Richmond Philanthropy Network luncheon. The contact mentioned it casually. "Did you know your ex-wife opened a literacy center?" Quite a thing, apparently. Caleb said he hadn't known. He said nothing else. That evening he sat in his apartment and thought about her at the gala. The red dress. The way the room had organized itself around her arrival without her asking it to. The way she had moved through the crowd with the ease of someone who was exactly where she was supposed to be. He thought about the restaurant, the laugh, Greg Paulson's brief discomfort. He thought about the kitchen table with the grant papers spread across it that he had walked past without asking a single question. He didn't reach out to Miriam. He understood, in the way that people eventually understand things they've been avoiding, that there was nothing to say, that an apology at this point would be an inconvenience to someone who had moved beyond the need for it. It was not a comfortable understanding, but it was at least an honest one. And Miriam? Miriam was at the Calloway Reading House at 8 o'clock that same evening, long after the staff had gone home, sitting in one of the reading corners with a cup of tea gone cold and a new grant proposal open on her laptop. There was a child's drawing on the wall behind her, a crayon rendering of a house with a red door and the words Calloway House carefully printed along the bottom in 7-year-old handwriting. She had not put it there. One of the kids had taped it up while she wasn't looking. She looked at it now and felt the specific contentment of a person who has built something that matters. Not for an audience. Not in response to someone else's cruelty. Not as proof. Simply because she had always been the kind of person who understood that the most meaningful things were usually the quiet ones. The ones nobody photographed. The ones that changed everything. The woman in the red dress didn't walk into that ballroom to reclaim herself. She walked in because she already had. And that is the thing about dignity, the real kind, not the performed kind. It doesn't announce itself. It doesn't need the room to go quiet or the right person notice. It simply exists. And sometimes, in a room full of carefully curated lives and expensive clothes and strategic smiles, the most powerful thing a woman can do is walk in wearing the dress she chose for herself and no one else. If Miriam's story moved you the way it moved me putting it together, the quiet years, the painful honesty of that restaurant moment, the slow, real rebuilding, I'd love to hear your thoughts. Drop a comment. Tell me what moment hit you hardest. Tell me whether you've ever had to rebuild something after someone convinced you to make yourself smaller. And if you believe that the real Miriams of this world deserve to be seen, subscribe to Orvin Stories. Share this video with someone who needs to hear it today. Like it if it reached you somewhere true. We tell these stories because they matter. Because somewhere in them, there's always a piece of something real. Until next time, stay with us at Orvin Stories. We'll be here,